Well, good morning, New Hope. I hope you enjoyed our time of worship. I just loved that. I could do that for so long. You know, there's times when things are going good in life, when everything seems to be going well and right, and everything's just swimming along. You know, the bills are paid, we're feeling healthy, everything's good. Our kids are still calling us, you know, even when we don't send them money. But then there's times in life. There's times in life when we just kind of, we hit our strike, you know, we run into a rough patch. And sometimes those are long term and sometimes they're just short term. Sometimes they just come in waves. And this week, I don't know about you, but this week was a rough week. Am I the only one? This was just a rough week. And I don't know that I can exactly put my finger on it. I mean, there's definitely signs and there's definitely things I can point to, but, you know, it's been a rough week. This week, Sierra Vista itself saw an 8-year-old child lost, missing. This week, our small little town experienced the death of a teenager, a high school senior on his way to school with his sister. And it's just tragic. It's just heartbreaking. And the mourning is just going through our town. And so I took my sermon this morning and I chucked it. And we're going in a different direction. Because I think it's something we need to address. I don't think it's something we can run from. I don't think it's something we can just water down or escape from or throw under the rug and say, oh, let's just move on. I want to deal this morning with this reality. I want to deal with the issue of where is God in my grief? Where is God when the bottom falls out? When everything just goes wrong? Where is God? Why does he seem so far away? And that's really the question that we want to answer this morning. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. If you'd turn with me there. Jesus is going to deal with something here. We're going to see him deal with a family that's in a tremendous amount of pain. A woman especially who's in a tremendous amount of pain. A woman who is widowed and her son has just come to the end of his life. And in Luke 7:11 it says, and following it says, soon afterward he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother. And she was a widow. Not bad enough that she just lost her son. She's even a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, now stop right there. Stop looking at your Bibles. I want you to stop right there for a second. When the Lord saw her, see, Jesus is about to do something with this woman. Jesus is about to speak into the life of this woman, and we'll hear what he has to say and what he will do. But just stop right there for a minute. Let's just take a little aside before you read the end of the story, because it'll be critical. See, here we see this woman, and she's watching her son walk, be walked down the street on a board, on a plank. That's how they carried the dead. It wasn't in a coffin. It was on a board, on a plank. And they carried her son down the street, and she's observing this. She's seeing all of this go on before her eyes. Can you imagine the pain, the suffering? And so here is this woman in this crowd of people as the city is gathering around her, and she's staring at her son, her only son. Not even a husband to share her grief with. You know, in the most painful moments of your life, in those times when everything that you thought you could count on is gone, have you ever wanted, have you ever hoped, have you ever wished that God would just be there physically present? Just so that you can look into his eyes and he can look into yours and see the pain. Just to see what you're going through. How would he respond to your pain? How would he respond to your grief, to your suffering? To just force him to look into your eyes at the death of your child. You see, this morning we're faced with the problem of pain. As a city, as a community, we're faced with the problem of pain, and it's not the first time and it won't be the last, but we need to be prepared for it. How do we reconcile suffering and pain with the character of God? How do we do that? You see, here's the question that ultimately rolls around in the back of our heads. Whether we're believers or unbelievers, here's the question we wrestle with. If we're honest, the question we're wrestling with is this: if God exists, and if he is good, and if he is all-powerful, then how can him being those two things allow sin and evil to go on? How can he allow suffering if he is all-powerful and all good? How is that possible? How does that work? Like if I was all-powerful, I'd snap my fingers and there would be no more suffering. Why not so with God? See, we know that God doesn't enjoy suffering, but we also know that he can stop it. But if he doesn't, then he must have some reason why he allows it to continue. There must be some reason this morning why God allowed that young boy to get into a car accident and die 2 days ago. There has to be a reason for it. And sometimes maybe it's a reason we don't understand. Not fully, not completely. I know the pat answer. I know the quick answer. I even know the theologically sound answer. Sin enters the world and everything's corrupted, and it wasn't necessarily his sin, but sin in general, and so everything's screwed up. And so the kid went and got himself killed because we're in a world of sin and because of God's allowing us to have freedom, free will, free choice. We have consequences for our actions and things like that happen. I get that. And I get that you get that. But I want more. You see, here's the options. Either there is no God, or he is not as good as we think he is, or he's not as powerful as we think he is, or there's another factor to the equation. Another thing that we need to consider. Another possibility. But you see, the Bible teaches clearly, cover to cover, that God exists and that he is good and that he is powerful. But God has a plan and a purpose that we cannot always see. See, suffering in this world is unavoidable. We live in a culture, we live in a society that really tries to do its best to escape pain and suffering at all costs. We mask it. We run from it. We try to cover it up. But it's there. You see, if you die young, it's a tragedy. But if you live long, you'll eventually die anyway. And while you're living, you're watching everyone else die. Either way, you find yourself knee-deep in death and pain in this life. Don't get me wrong, there's good times. There certainly are. And there's times that are so good that we even forget how bad things could be. But this life is knee-deep in pain. And you and I as believers, folks, we've got to deal with that. We've got to reconcile that with our idea of who God is. See, other cultures out there in the world, if you go to most parts of the world, you will find that there are other cultures who deal in pain and misery and suffering and hunger and death on a daily basis. It's not a whoops, it's not a once in a while thing, it's not a ooh, it made the headline. I mean, there are kids that are dying every day. But see, most Western cultures handle suffering quite differently because we're not quite as used to it. And because God does not give us all of the answers to the problem of pain, often our culture uses pain as an excuse to walk away from believing in God. And that's where many people find themselves. They find themselves questioning the very existence of God Himself in a world filled with evil. In a world filled with senseless violence, in a world filled with pain, in a world filled with suffering, in a world in which it doesn't make sense why God would allow such things to happen.
I see in my mom and my dad and people who I look at as Christians, real Christians who have a love for God. I see this spark in them. I just wonder sometimes about myself why I don't have that. Christianity and Jesus and all that stuff's been in my life since I can ever remember. So it makes me question whether it's my faith sometimes, or whether it's my parents' faith. If it's just something our society grows up with, and it's just part of our culture. I've been questioning God's existence probably since I was 12. The thing that made me question God the most was living in a suburban area where Christianity is the main religion. I'm seeing a lot of poverty, a lot of pretty heartbreaking stuff. And you go to places like Africa and you see everyone's lives is like this. It's not, 1 out of 30. It's everyone. And it's like, did God forsaken this place? Does He just not care about these people? It's almost like God just forgot about it. I don't know why God allows suffering. I wrestle with that a lot, but I do blame Him per se for not doing anything about it. I don't understand how you can sit back and have all this power and watch people suffer so greatly. It's hard to believe that if you had the power to stop it, you wouldn't. I look at it as, if there was a God, He wouldn't allow this suffering. So because there is suffering, there is no God, or because there is no God, there's suffering. I do question what will happen when I die, whether I just no longer there, or if there is an eternity. I really hope there is an eternity.
See, those are the things we wrestle with. Those are the things we struggle with. And we can deal with it in two ways. We can deal with suffering with belief, or we can deal with suffering with disbelief. What happens when we deal with suffering, when we experience suffering in disbelief? Because the ultimate question is, if there's a God and He's good, how can He allow evil to exist? And so we don't believe. There was a Barna poll done not many years ago when this was the number one reason why people don't believe in God. Because of the existence of suffering. Because of the existence of pain. And we've just talked about the fact that the right answer, the biblical answer, the theologically correct answer for the reason of pain is simply because we have free will. And sin, the choice of our sin, has corrupted the world in which we live. So, for example, in Romans 8:22, we read, "For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." Why? Because it's corrupted by sin. Our sin, my sin, your sin. Adam and Eve's sin. But suffering is used as an excuse either to not believe in God or to hate him, to think of his character as being less than what it actually is. So you and I as Christians have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to try to address this issue with the world that is asking, with a town, with Sierra Vista, who is asking, why did God, if he's there, allow this kid to die? How do you answer that question when it's asked? Because we need to answer that question. But let me put this another way. It is a valid question to ask, why, if there's a God, is there suffering? But there's an equally valid question we can ask as well. And it's a question that one who denies God must ultimately answer as well. How do you explain the existence of good in the world if there is no God? How do you explain the existence of good in the world? You see, the vast majority of people that reject the Christian worldview. They do it by actually borrowing from the Bible. And I'll show you what I mean. If you reject the existence of God on the premise that, there's evil, and so if God is good and he's all-powerful, therefore he cannot exist because evil exists. Let me ask another question then, if I may. Why do you say it's evil? Where do you get that it's evil? What makes you think that child dying is evil? What makes you think that children being abused is evil? What makes you think that anything is evil? Because after all, we're just a bunch of particles floating around that came here by time, chance, and circumstance. It's survival of the fittest, isn't it? There really is no, and can be, here's the kicker, there can be no right and wrong in a purely naturalistic world. There's no such thing. So where did you get your idea that something is wrong, that something is immoral, that something is evil? I'll tell you where. You borrowed it. You borrowed it from God. From the fact that God has made us in his image, and therefore we have inside of us an innate sense of that which is right and wrong. Because he has created us to be so. Otherwise, nothing would have any meaning at all. May I encourage you, if you're there today, and my heart goes out, it truly does. If you're there today and you are asking the question, why, if there's a God, would he allow evil? May I ask you to consider the previous point? And may I ask you humbly to investigate the facts before you come to a conclusion. Before dismissing God, before dismissing the Bible, investigate it. Have the guts to look at the truth. Not just the popular media stereotypes of Christianity. I mean real Christianity, what the Bible teaches. You see, the Bible gives us a worldview that can stand up to the greatest intellectual scrutiny that can ever be thrown at it. It can stand up to it. We're not running, we're not hiding, we're not pretending, we're not making excuses. God exists, and he is able to deal even with your pain. And I say that in all humility. The question is this: if you believe in God, if you believe that he exists, then how do you process suffering? How do you deal with suffering in faith? We talked about dealing with suffering and disbelief. How do you deal with suffering and faith? When Christian Smith and fellow researchers at the University of North Carolina studied religious belief held among teenagers in America, they found that the faith they held, the faith that most adolescents out there in the United States hold, basically boils down to moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, that's a big fancy word. Let me boil it down for you. Basically, someone who believes in moralistic therapeutic deism believes the following. One, they believe that God basically wants me to live a moral life, And then if I'm a good person, whatever that means, if I'm good, that he owes me a good life. God wants us to be good, to be nice, to be fair to each other, like most of the world religions teach. Not all of them. They believe that the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself, to have a good positive self-esteem. They believe that God does not need to be involved in my life except when needed to solve a problem. They believe that all good people go to heaven. Is that about right? Does that about summarize what's out there? That's about it, isn't it? See, it's all about obtaining subjective well-being for us. Peace, love, harmony, prosperity, all that stuff. That's moralistic therapeutic deism. Has very little to do with Scripture. And at its core, at the core of this belief, is pride. At the core of this belief is the pride, the lack of humility, which leads us to believe that somehow we are the center of the universe, that we are the ultimate judges, the arbiters of that which is right and wrong. Because of our enlightened state, after all, we've come so far, from 100 years ago, right? So because we're enlightened now, we are now the judges. There is no longer in our society a humility before the mystery of creation and the Creator. But it is so ingrained in our culture, that whole thinking that I described is so a part of our American culture. It's so deeply ingrained in us that we don't even catch it anymore. I mean, really, it's almost like what it is to be American, right? To do good and stand up for others and just be a good guy, and right? The American way. Not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. Unless, of course, you're asking what God wants. See, we need to reorder our thinking. We need to reorder our heart's affections. You say, what do you mean by that? Here's what I mean. St. Augustine said that at the core of who we are, we are determined by what we love. See, what do you love? See, suffering has this, going through pain has this unique ability to weed out what we really, really love, what we're really all about, and to show us the very things that are so misprioritized in our hearts. You see, prosperity pollutes and calamity clarifies. That's how it is. And in fact, the Bible speaks of suffering as being a refining fire. Something that purifies, something that makes us cleaner than we were before. Because suffering should lead us to hope in God rather than in ourselves. See, what we love is what we ultimately hope in. What we love is what actually our real faith is ultimately placed in. What is your faith in? Can I ask you this morning, what is your hope in? What do you hope above all things? Is it our jobs, our abilities, our position, our reputation, our accomplishments, our discipline, our talents, our prosperity, even our family maybe? But what happens when something takes away your family? What happens when something ruins your career and your health falls apart? See, unless your hope and unless your love are in something greater, unless your hope and your affection and your love are in God, then your hope and your love and your affection will be in the things of this world. And may I tell you that every single thing in this world will perish. It'll fade away. It may not be today and it might not be tomorrow, but it's coming. Be prepared to lose your family. Be prepared to lose your mother, your father. Be prepared, spouses, to lose your wife, your husband. It's coming. And heaven forbid, some of us may lose our children. That's something I wouldn't wish on anybody. But when it happens, folks, when it happens, how do we deal with it? Romans 8:22. It says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. See, God, even though God never causes evil, but he does allow evil to take place. So even though God allows evil to take place, he never does evil, but he can take that evil and he can use it for good. And that's what this passage is talking about. Even if you're going through horrible things, he can take that and he can use it for good. God can even use evil and tragedy ultimately for good. I'm going to say something strange to you this morning. I'm going to tell you something you've probably never heard from a pulpit. What I'm going to tell you is that losing your faith might be the best thing that's ever happened to you. And I'll tell you why. See, if your faith has been in your own goodness, and if your faith has even been in your own devotion to God, if your faith has been in your own faith, maybe it's a good thing to lose. I don't know if you're tracking with me. See, sometimes we have more faith in our own faith than we have faith in God. Isn't that weird? Maybe it's time we just lost that. Maybe it's time we said, you know what? I don't understand why you would let this kid die. Maybe it's okay to say to God, I just don't get it. With all the books I read and all the theology I study and everything I know, I still don't completely get it. I really don't. Maybe it's okay for us to say that to God. Maybe it's okay for us to admit that. Say, God, I just don't get it. Maybe losing our faith in our faith could be a good thing. See, our faith must be in God. If our faith is in God, then our faith is in his sovereignty. And if our faith is in his sovereignty, then we understand by that very definition that there are certain things we'll never answer. We'll never have the complete answers to these things. Our faith is in a God who is sovereign, a God who knows better than us, a God in whom we can trust. Because here's the kicker. Real faith, biblical faith, is only ever truly demonstrated when we do not understand. Then it's faith. Because if we completely understood, we wouldn't need faith. Because what you see before your eyes, you don't need faith to believe. Now, we're not saying check your brain out at the door. Far from it. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. But there are things in this life we will never understand. May I encourage you to try to pursue your understanding of sound biblical theology when it comes to these things. God's sovereignty, God's omnipotence. It'll help you when the bottom falls out. See, when the bottom falls out of your life, it's almost too late to start thumbing through passages in the Bible. It's almost too late. You should have those things already supported. You should have those ideas already well grounded in you. You know, we kind of live in a whatever kind of society. We live in a society that is largely just, whatever. Church. Bible, come on, give me a break, will ya? Last thing I need to do, look, I'm busy. Last thing I need to do is study theology. Really? You'll get unbusy real quick when the bottom falls out in your life. We live in a whatever society, disinterested, aloof to the things of God, until, of course, it's too late, and then we lay all the blame on Him. Right? That's how it works. Classic. Do we respond with bitterness and a shaking of our fist in the face of God when tragedy strikes? When suffering comes, is that how we react? See, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something about me, and I'll tell you something about you. When suffering comes, it reveals who you and I really are. It reveals, it refines, it burns down to the essence, our very character, our core. And it really reveals the ultimate object of our faith. It's very, very easy to become bitter at God, to begin blaming
I grew up in
God.
Calcutta, India, a city of 21 million people. I grew up in a Christian home, and very early on in my life, I realized that faith was something that was pretty important to my parents, so I began to go through the motions of church life. But age 9, a tragedy hits home. I watched my only sister die to leukemia, and I watched the hopeless and hapless efforts of my parents trying to do everything to save her life. I saw fasting, I saw people praying and fasting, and in the end she ended up dying, and I didn't quite understand that. How could a loving God allow tragedies like that? So I turned my back on the faith of my parents, started doing my own thing. But my mother, she one day bribed me to church. She said, if you go to church, I'll give you more pocket money. And I'm sitting in this youth meeting, and the preacher is an American missionary, and his words are, Christianity is not religion, it's friendship with God of eternity. And it's the first time I'd ever heard anyone say that and define Christianity in such a unique way. And those words really opened my eyes, and I said, God, my fight with you is over. Thought my calling was in business. I ended up with degrees in business and was done with business school, working for a corporation in India. That's when I would meet my wife. And in February of 2001, we decided to pack up our bags and leave Calcutta, India for a new life in America. And in the most amazing way, I find work on the 81st floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. My wife finds work on the 71st floor of the South Tower. From nothing, we now both making great money, we both have great jobs. September 11, 2001 rolls in, and then everything changed. 8:48 in the morning, I'm standing by this fax machine and I'm trying to send some documents out to our office in Philadelphia when I hear this incredible explosion. This was American Flight 11. This plane had come crashing into our tower. The plane struck a few floors above us, but part of the wing of the plane and debris from the plane crashes through our floor. Jet fuel spreading around us, fire breaking out all around us. The building is swaying from the left to the right. The elevators were blown up because of the jet fuel that come down the elevator shaft, so the only way out was the stairwell. I looked at my watch. It's past 8:45 in the morning, and I'm saying, God, you know my wife's story. Every normal day, she's on the 71st floor of the South Tower. We hear an explosion. This is the second plane crashing into the second tower. So I start walking towards the South Tower to be looking for my wife. And that's when the unthinkable, the unimaginable happens. I'm 15, 20 feet away from this building when the ground begins to shake. The South Tower was finally imploding and going down. I'm lying there with my face flat on the ground. I realize I'm being buried in debris. Soot, glass, all kinds of stuff fall on me. But after about 20 minutes, I was kind of surprised. I'm still alive. I'm out of the debris. Both the towers have collapsed, and I'm saying, God, why did you spare my life? For sure, my wife is dead. 4 months pregnant, there's no way my wife is going to come down all those flights. I'm sitting right in the middle of one of the streets of New York City, just a crazy man, having given up hope over my wife, just angry, bitter. Some of those emotions that I went through at age 9, losing my sister, begins to run through my mind again. God, where were you when this whole thing was being plotted? So God, why didn't you step in and save the day? 3,000 people died today. And my cell phone begins to ring for the very first time. I flip my phone and it's my wife's caller ID. And I'm saying, this can't be her. But when I picked up the call and I said hello, it's my wife on the other side. Her life was spared. My wife and I, we meet each other late that day. It was the most amazing moment. And what had happened to her, she wanted to go to work early that day, but that day she was late to work. This tragedy has kind of opened my eyes to the suffering that goes on in our world. A lot of things that I had ignored, earlier. And now I begin to understand that there's a lot of people hurting. And so for us, what we were able to do with that story was give the story into God's hand, and God just took away all that anger, and He took away all that bitterness and questions, and I traded it for joy and peace.
See, we need a broader perspective. We need to be able to make sense of suffering when it happens to us. How do we do that? See, suffering leads us to certain things. Charles Spurgeon once said this. He said, "If I cannot believe that God is in the worst things that happen to me, then I cannot believe in God at all." You see, this is the true test of your faith. How do we make sense of suffering? Suffering should lead us to perseverance, and perseverance should lead us to better character, and character should lead us to hope. God's purpose in suffering beyond just making us better people, what is it? We can't know. I don't know what the answer to that question is. But I know that suffering does make us better, or it makes us bitter. You'll either get better or you'll get bitter. I pray that you'll get better. I pray that you get closer to God instead of farther away. I pray that you find the answers instead of running from truth. What do we know about suffering? Let's begin with what we do, or let's end with what we do know about suffering. What we know for sure about suffering is that if there was no suffering, there could never be in our world such a thing as courage. We would never know such things as heroism, sacrifice. Those things would be foreign to us without suffering. Our character would never be refined without suffering. But in closing, I want to just kind of try to take a little bit broader look. I want to get a broader perspective that I can leave you with. Try this exercise sometime. Maybe this week when you go home. Take a piece of paper and on one side of it, write down all the best things that have ever happened to you in your life. And on the other side, write down all the worst things that have ever happened to you in your life. And then look how many of those good things are directly connected to the grief and to the suffering and to the pain on the other side of the page. It's amazing. You'll be amazed. And the older I get, the clearer it becomes to me that these lists overlap. See, right now we're living in this world and we're like myopic. All we can see is like what's right there in front of our face. And that's what makes it so tough. But in retrospect of eternity, you and I will see clearly and look back with thankfulness for the fact that God has allowed us to go through certain events in our lives that were tragic at the time, because they were for the greatest possible good. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 through 13 says, "Beloved, do not be surprised when at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when His glory is revealed." See, there's an unfolding drama in your life. There's an unfolding drama in my life. This story isn't finished. The story's going somewhere. The story with the tragedy, the horrible tragedy that Sierra Vista experienced this week, it's going somewhere. This isn't the end. There is a middle plot, and it has tension. as every plot must have tension, but there is an answer at the end. There is a happy ending. But you and I are living in the middle of the story, and we need to somehow endure. We need to understand why this suffering is going on. Our paradigm must shift from viewing life in the here and now, in the today and tomorrow, to viewing life from the perspective, from the lens of eternity. How does it look? How does our suffering and our pain look from the perspective of eternity? You see, I think that the worst thing that could ever happen to you in this life is to live a pleasant life with no pain, no suffering, and then find out at the end of it you're spending an eternity in hell. It's the worst thing that could ever happen to you. So if God needs to get your attention with pain, I pray that He does it. I pray that He draws you to Himself through those things so that you can get an eternal perspective. You see, this life we live isn't all there is. Why do we live like this is the end? Why do we live like this is everything that there is to existence? For I consider Romans 8, I consider the sufferings of this world, of this present time, are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Isn't that something? That all this suffering that we're going through, it's nothing. It's not even worthy to be compared with what's going to happen in heaven. Matthew chapter 6, verse 20 and 21, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Isn't that something? See, where's your treasure this morning? Where's your heart this morning? Is this in a place other than just the here and that now? See, we live in this life, but we must not live for it. There's a difference. Let me ask you this. Do you think that the suffering in this world, no matter how bad it is, do you think that the suffering in this world will be worth it after the first 2 minutes in heaven? Okay, let me back up. How about after the first 2 days in heaven? No? 2 weeks? 2 years? The first 200 years? The first 2,000 years? The first 2 million years? The first 2 billion years? You write in the number, go ahead. See, at some point, it'll be all worth it. It'll be all worth it. Suffering has a quality to it that makes things better. You know, after 9/11, over 90% of the people in the country attended church for the following 3 weeks. Crazy, right? After the disaster in New Orleans, crime rate drastically dropped. After this tragic death of this young boy happened in Sierra Vista is coming together to rally around this family, and perhaps, maybe, they're beginning to think about God. We need an eternal perspective. We started with this widow, and we're ending with this widow. We're ending with this mother. Her only son just died. And they're carrying him through the streets on a board, and here she is. All she can do is watch. That's all she can do. Pretty soon we're going to have a funeral in Sierra Vista for this young man, and his mother will be there. And she'll be watching. She'll be watching. See, Joseph Bailey knew something about losing children. In fact, he and his wife Mary Lou lost 3 sons. One at 18 days old after surgery, another at 5 years old with leukemia, and a third at 18 years old, just like this young man who died. One at 18 years old after a sledding accident. And Joseph Bailey wrote these words. Listen to this. He says, of all the deaths, that of a child is the most unnatural and the hardest to bear. Children were made for fun, for laughter, for sunshine, not for pain. And when a child dies, a part of that parent is buried. And he goes on to tell this story. He said, I met a man who was in his 70s. During our first 10 minutes speaking together, he pulled out his wallet and brought the faded photograph of a child out. It was his child, who he lost over 50 years ago. See, this procession of death and sorrow collided with a procession of life that Jesus was leading. As the procession of this funeral, with all the followers of this funeral were coming, they met with the procession that Jesus was leading of his followers, and they collided together. And something happened. This procession of death collided with a procession of life and hope. And in Luke 11:17, we read, soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain. This is where we began, and this is where we end. And his disciples and a great crowd went with him, and he drew near the gate of the town, and behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bier. That's the board that the boy is on. That bier is that board that he's carried on. And the bearer stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. Whew. And Jesus gave him to his mother. And what do you think that looked like? Can you go there for a moment with me? What do you think that looked like? See, Jesus brings life from death. That's what he's all about. He takes your pain and your tragedy and he turns it into something wonderful. Perhaps this morning you're like this woman who lost her son. Maybe this morning you are the woman who lost her son. And your heart has just flat run out of hope. You may believe in God, you may not. But you've gotten to the point where you're just out of hope. You don't know where to turn. You don't just need a change of attitude. You need a connection with the source of hope. Because even when we can't see him, or even when we can't feel his presence, he is with us in our pain. He promised us that. In Hebrews 4:14, he says, since we have a great high priest, that's Jesus, by the way, who passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Why? Why should we hold fast our confession? Why should we hold fast our belief in God? Because we have a high priest in heaven who's gone through everything we've gone through, and then some. And Scripture says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every aspect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence, catch this, let's with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. See, if you're ever, catch this if you catch nothing else this morning. If you are ever at the point in your life when you are in doubt of God's love, just remember the cross. Amen. Just remember the cross. Remember what he went through for you. See, because Jesus is the only answer that is bigger than your questions. He's bigger than the why. He's bigger than the I don't understand. He's bigger than the questions. Whatever the ultimate answer is, I know that I can trust him. Because Jesus has earned my trust, and I hope he's earned yours. Even in the darkest days, with God, there is peace, because Jesus ultimately came to bring us hope. And that's what he's all about.